Okay, so good morning. We're really happy to have today Ross Hetrick of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, who is the president and founder of the Thaddeus Stevens Society. Ross, thank you so much for being here. I think we're going to learn a lot from you today. Could you tell us a little bit about, to start off, what is the Thaddeus Stevens Society?
Thaddeus Stevens Society is a nonprofit organization founded in 1999 to promote the memory and legacy of Thaddeus Stevens. And in that time, we've done a lot of different things, like helping to maintain his cemetery over in Lancaster. In 2022, we put up a statue of Thaddeus Stevens in Gettysburg, which is only the second statue of Thaddeus Stevens. The first one going up in 2008 over in Lancaster at the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. And I have special news for your audience today. We just this weekend signed a lease for a storefront in Gettysburg, which will be the first Thaddeus Stevens museum in the country. And we're going to have a grand opening of that, or at least we plan on having a grand opening of that on April 4th of this year, which is Thaddeus Stevens' birthday.
Wow, wonderful
So
news.
that's going to be a big thing. And if any of your students are in the Gettysburg area on that date or afterwards, we invite them to come over and see all sorts of Thaddeus Stevens artifacts and exhibits.
Congratulations. What a wonderful, wonderful resource. That's really great to hear. So thank you for sharing a little bit about the society. Maybe we could back up a little bit because a lot of Americans, and I think many of my students, might not know who Thaddeus Stevens is. So could you take some time and explain who was this important figure in American history, and why do you feel he's so important?
Yeah, that's exactly why I started the Thaddeus Stevens Society back in 1999, because I was horrified when I visited Thaddeus Stevens' grave in the 1980s, and it was overgrown. Nobody was taking care of it. Nobody in Lancaster knew who he was. His house hadn't been restored or anything. So that was, I decided at that time that sometime I would found the Thaddeus Stevens Society. Now, I call Thaddeus Stevens the greatest unknown person in American history, or the 17th and a half president, because he led a veto-proof Congress against Andrew Johnson. What he accomplished was, one, he was the most powerful congressman during and after the Civil War. He helped persuade Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He was instrumental in the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, as shown in the movie Lincoln, where he was ably portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones, but he did not have a Texas drawl. He was the father of the 14th Amendment, the single most important amendment to the Constitution, requiring equal treatment under the law and also extending civil liberties to the state level. He spearheaded the impeachment of Andrew Johnson and was one of the architects of Reconstruction. So that is his importance to American history. In fact, I would say he was the essential man in Reconstruction.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we start our course with Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War. So let's drill down into that a little bit. Could you explain how and why was Thaddeus Stevens so important to Reconstruction, and what were some of his accomplishments during that really critical period in American history?
Okay, well, I would start. Okay, I will tell you, I'm going to do four things. One, I'm going to explain how Reconstruction started, how the 14th Amendment came about and what it did, also the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and then about the Johnson impeachment. The beginning was on December 4th, 1865, or as I say, the day that Thaddeus Stevens and Edward McPherson saved the country. What had happened, as everybody knows, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865. And Amazingly, this is something that's really kind of one of the really quirks of American history. A Southern Democrat became president, somebody who had represented a Southern state before the Civil War, which was Andrew Johnson. Now, it seems really kind of crazy that you would have a Southern Democrat as the vice president, when you're battling Southern Democrats. And what had happened is in 1864, it was very uncertain that Lincoln was going to get reelected. And so they had Hannibal Hamlin was the vice president at that time. So Lincoln jettisoned Hannibal Hamlin and he took on Andrew Johnson, who was somewhat of a star in the North because he was the only Southern senator who didn't leave the Senate. He was against secession. Now, he was against secession, but he wasn't against slavery, and he wasn't against the general way that the South operated. Even though he was a populist, he was more attuned to the poor whites, but he had no love for the black population. Okay. So anyway, it's interesting that Lincoln asked Thaddeus Stevens about his opinion of Andrew Johnson, and Thaddeus Stevens, I can just imagine how he said it. He says, Andrew Johnson is a rank demagogue and a scoundrel to boot. Unfortunately, Lincoln didn't take his advice, and he made him his vice president. So Lincoln's assassinated, and Andrew Johnson becomes president. And more interesting was that Congress was not in session in between April, when Lincoln was assassinated, in December 4th. Back in those days, they had this weird thing where they would elect congressmen in November, then they wouldn't meet for more than a year. So from April until December, Johnson had a free hand to do whatever he wanted to do, despite people like Thaddeus Stevens saying, hey, call us to session. We got to work together. Johnson said, just, hit the road. I'm going to do it myself. I don't care about you guys. So what Johnson did was he started issuing pardons wholesale, started pardoning everybody down in the South. And he let them hold elections with no restrictions. And of course, it only involved white men being in the electorate. And what did they do? They elected Confederate officials to the House and the Senate. In fact, the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, no relation to Thaddeus Stevens, was elected to the Senate. And they planned these these ex-Confederate officials were planning to join up with their Northern Democratic allies and take over Congress. And you would have had the Congress, the Senate, and the presidency all in Southern hands if this had happened. And they were actually considering, they let it be known that they were going to reject the federal debt and embrace the Confederate debt so that the Union would have to pay for the war against it. Even worse, they were going to reinstate slavery after the Civil War. And you say, how could they reinstate slavery? Because the 13th Amendment had been passed. There's a big loophole in the 13th Amendment. It says involuntary servitude is illegal, except if you're a convict. So the Southerners, being clever people, made all black people convicts. And they did that because they were allowed, because the 14th Amendment had not been passed, they could make specific laws for specific populations. So they passed what was called the Black Codes, which only applied to blacks. And it basically said, if you are a black person, you step off your plantation, you can be arrested for vagrancy because you don't have a job. This is a law that didn't apply to whites, only to blacks. And if you didn't have $250 to pay the fine, you were put back on the plantation as convict labor. So these were the stakes. reinstatement of slavery and also the denial of the federal debt when Congress was going to open up on December 4th, 1865. But Thaddeus Stevens, who basically ran Congress, was not going to let this happen. And he came up with a plan that involved Edward McPherson, who was the clerk of the House and also a longtime associate of Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, he got him his job as clerk of the House. And he was from Gettysburg, Edward McPherson. So, like every other session of Congress, Edward McPherson was calling the roll of the Congress, and he got to the Southern names and he skipped them. He didn't call them out. The Southerners and their allies jumped up and down and said, "You can't do this, you can't do that." Thaddeus Stevens gets up and says, "Point of order, we conduct no business until the roll is called." The roll was finished. The Southerners were out, giving the Republicans a working majority where they were able to override certain vetoes. And that actually increased after the election of 1866 when Andrew Johnson, trying to create support, did what was called the swing around the circle, a nationwide lecture or rally thing, which actually alienated more people than helped him. So he actually helped his opponents take over the House and Senate. So anyway, so this created basically created a situation where Congress was able to run Reconstruction rather than having Johnson run Reconstruction. And even more importantly, it allowed them to ultimately pass the 14th Amendment, which substantially changed the way that our Constitution works. Now, with the 14th Amendment, why did we need to have a 14th Amendment? Well, for one thing, there was the issue of citizenship. The Dred Scott decision was still in force, which basically said that blacks could not be citizens. In fact, interestingly enough, as a little on the side, the James Buchanan administration, which basically lobbied for that position, just to show you how racist that administration was, they used the Dred Scott decision to deny passports to free blacks after that decision. So, which just is nasty. In any case, the Dred Scott decision was still in force, so they needed to change the Constitution so as to determine who actually was a citizen of the United States. Before that, besides the Dred Scott decision, states had basically decided who citizens were and who were not. So that was why they had to put into that amendment that anyone born in the United States was a citizen. Then they also had to codify one of the founding principles, even though it was not a law of the country, which is all men are created equal. And you probably know that the Declaration of Independence has no legal force. And so they needed to also put that in there that had a equal rights. Now, interestingly, they went even further and they decided that they needed to put into the 14th Amendment that the states could not abridge certain rights. Lots of people do not realize, even though the Bill of Rights is taught to everyone, before the 14th Amendment, that did not apply to the states. It only restricted the federal government. Like, for instance, freedom of the press, there was no freedom of the press in the South. If you tried to publish abolitionist material, you were shut down. Even if you imported it from the North, you would be met by mobs which would gather it up and burn it in a big bonfire. So they could not really have a discussion about whether they wanted to get rid of abolition, because the powers that be basically just shut that down. So the 14th Amendment, they had a number of different important parts. In fact, I would recommend everybody reading it because it actually even applies nowadays. There's a discussion about whether or not insurrectionists should be allowed to be on our ballot, because there's a provision in that amendment restricting or prohibiting insurrectionists from being on our ballot. How that turns out, we'll all find out soon. But Thaddeus Stevens introduced the 14th Amendment. And of course, it was changed around and modified. In fact, at one point, Thaddeus Stevens threatened to vote against his own amendment because in changing it, the Congress stuck in a provision that voting depended on you being male. It basically said this applies to all voters who are male, which Thaddeus Stevens was very much opposed to. He felt it was wrong to put male into the Constitution. In fact, he kind of made a joke about it. He, being a lifelong bachelor, said, "I don't really understand why you want to put male in there. All the bachelors in Congress are against it. It's only the married guys that seem to want it. What sort of problem do they have with women?" But in any case, that went through, unfortunately. And but Thaddeus Stevens, after everything was said and done, decided that he was not going to hold out, that he was going to go along with it. And there's particularly one quote, I think, which kind of sums up Thaddeus Stevens' overall philosophy and his decision to back the revamped 14th Amendment. He says, "In my youth, in my manhood, in my old age, I had fondly dreamed that when any fortunate chance should have broken up for a while the foundations of our institutions and released us from obligations the most tyrannical that ever man imposed in the name of freedom, that the intelligent, pure, and just men of this republic, true to their professions and their conscience, would have so remodeled all our institutions as to have freed them from every vestige of human oppression, of inequality of rights, of recognized degradation of the poor and the superior caste of the rich. In short, that no distinction would be tolerated in this purified republic but what arose from merit and conduct. This bright dream has vanished like the baseless fabric of a vision. I find that we shall be obliged to be content with patching up the worst portions of the ancient edifice and leaving it in many of its parts to be swept through by the tempests, the frosts, and the storms of despotism. Do you inquire why, holding these views and possessing some will of my own, I accept so imperfect a proposition? I answer, because I live among men and not among angels, among men as intelligent, as determined, as independent as myself, who, not agreeing with me, do not choose to yield their opinions to mine. Mutual concession, therefore, is our only resort, or mutual hostilities. And that is from June 13th, 1866. So the 14th Amendment is approved by the House and the Senate. And initially, despite Thaddeus Stevens being against this, it was sent to all the states, including the southern states, who immediately rejected it, which would have meant that the 14th Amendment would not get the 3/4 approval from the states required. Well, after this happened, the Congress said, well, we're going to kind of show you. What they did was they started on the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. And the Reconstruction Acts were necessary because the Southern elites started wholesale slaughter of Black freemen. In fact, it came to such a crazy head there were riots in both Memphis and in New Orleans, where there were just gangs of whites going out and mowing down blacks. That it became a national scandal, and so the Congress, worked through what's known as the Reconstruction Act of 1867 that did a variety of things. But the most important thing it did was essentially take the statehood away from the southern states and made them military districts administered by generals. And it also required that all of the states redo their constitutions so as to become democratic. And it also required that all of these states allow black men, they weren't so progressive as to require women, but black men had the vote. And then the last thing it did also, which is an interesting twist, is it required these states, once they required these states as part of their readmission into the Union, to approve the 14th Amendment. So essentially, Congress forced the southern states to approve the 14th Amendment. Now, this was very tough in getting through Reconstruction Acts. And Thaddeus Stevens, who was the biggest pusher for these acts, was he was slowly dying in the last few years of his life. In fact, he only had a few more years to die. He was going to die in August of 1868, and this was 1867. And he was so weak while they were discussing these Reconstruction Acts that he had to actually be carried in to pursue this effort. And in fact, it came to a head on February 13th, 1867, where he was brought in, and his voice was so weak that people had to crowd around him to hear what he was saying. And part of his speech was, for the last few months, Congress has been sitting here, and while the South has been bleeding at every pore, Congress has done nothing to protect the loyal people there, white or black, either in their persons, in their liberty, or in their property. And amazingly, that speech turned the tide. The Reconstruction Act was approved, and the conditions I outlined earlier were adopted. Interestingly enough, as an aside, Thaddeus Stevens was perhaps the funniest congressman in U.S. history. And on another occasion, he's being carried in, like I said, and he looks down at the guys carrying him in, and he says, "What am I going to do when you're all dead and gone?" Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that was the two very important parts of Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment and the Reconstruction Acts. Now, one of the strange things about our government is in the Constitution, it says legislation is determined by Congress, and the president is supposed to execute those bills and that legislation. Of course, this is crazy when you have one party in control of the legislature and another party in control of the presidency. So what happened was the Congress was executing laws, saying you put the southern states under military control, and the president would appoint generals which would administer those military districts. Well, Andrew Johnson, who was one of the most bullheaded presidents in our history, basically said, "Well, I'll see what I'm going to do about putting people in charge." And he was putting, generals who were very sympathetic to the South, and basically were going to let them get away with anything. And of course, this was like going against everything that Congress wanted him to do. So Congress, trying to get their policies enacted, passed the Tenure of Office Act. They were thinking, well, we can't control Andrew Johnson, but the cabinet that was left over from Lincoln were good Republicans, and they would actually see, the policies implemented. And that was passed, vetoed, and then his veto was overridden. So it was a legitimate law. A lot of people will say, well, it was unconstitutional. Well, it wasn't decided that it was unconstitutional until later. So it was a legitimate law. So the so Andrew Johnson not getting the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to do what he wanted him to do, that he wanted Ed Stanton to appoint Southern loyalists to generals in the military district. He tried to fire him unsuccessfully, and that provoked the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Now, they had the best chance of ever actually impeaching a president at that time. In fact, let me just look up something here. Well, I don't have that. At that time, and Thaddeus Stevens tried to spearhead that, but unfortunately, he was not. He was one of the impeachment senators, but he was in very ill health. Consider this was like 3 months before he died in 1868. So it went to Benjamin Butler. Some historians feel that if Thaddeus Stevens had been in better health, that the impeachment would have actually resulted in Johnson's removal. As it was, Johnson was saved by one vote in the Senate. And then Thaddeus Stevens, being carried out of the Senate at that vote, exclaimed to the crowd, he says, "The country is going to the devil." And so, that was a big disappointment to Thaddeus Stevens. And in fact, before the verdict came in, he said, if we cannot remove a president under the circumstances they had, particularly since they had all the ex-Confederates out of Congress at that day, if we cannot remove him in this situation, the only way that a president will ever be removed in the future is the way they removed Julius Caesar back in Rome's time. And you may recall, or I'll tell your students, it was not a very pretty way that they removed him. It involved many stab wounds. But in any case, I think, to tell you the truth, that prediction has kind of really been proven out in recent years. I think our impeachment situation you cannot remove a president by impeachment, but that is my personal opinion. Maybe somewhere in the future that will change. But in any case, besides being disappointed by the outcome of the impeachment, there was another thing that Thaddeus Stevens was truly disappointed in. He wanted, as part of Reconstruction, the redistribution of the land in the South. It was 1.8% of the people in the South, the super rich, so to say, owned over 80% of the land. And Thaddeus Stevens wanted to confiscate the property from those super rich and to redistribute it to the newly freed slaves, and also provide them with some money for buying equipment. This is generally known as the 40 acres and a mule that Sherman tried to pursue right after the war, which was reversed by Johnson, and then was tried to pursue by Thaddeus Stevens in the Congress. Unfortunately, that was such an unpopular measure that it didn't even get out of committee. And Thaddeus Stevens said at the time, he said, if we don't approve this, we might as well have left them in bondage, because this was so important to have economic freedom besides having the political freedom. So Thaddeus Stevens died rather regretting what had happened. But on the other hand, he accomplished so much and really should be remembered as much as Abraham Lincoln, because in fact, contemporaries, said this. I didn't say this, but contemporaries at the time said that it was really that you would have Thaddeus Stevens going through the fields, removing the trees and the boulders, and Lincoln following behind, spreading the seeds of freedom behind him. In fact, the way that people reacted to his death, if you look at the major newspapers at that time, like the New York Tribune, it devoted the entire front page to Thaddeus Stevens' death. And Thaddeus Stevens lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, only the third person to have been so honored after Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln. And 20,000 people attended his funeral over Lancaster. And his funeral was held in a rather small cemetery in Lancaster, because Thaddeus Stevens demanded that he be buried in the only integrated cemetery in Lancaster at that time. And his epitaph says, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator." That ends my dissertation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ross. I mean, what a incredible story, and you just tell it with such clarity and passion. And I experienced that when I was walking the streets of Gettysburg and came across the really great statue that you guys erected of Thaddeus Stevens, and connected with you and saw all of the resources and all the advocacy you've been doing around the history of Thaddeus Stevens. So in our last couple minutes here, I just had one more question. So, after hearing your story, I mean, Thaddeus Stevens was an incredibly critical figure in the reinvention of our nation. But being from Illinois, we remember Abraham Lincoln really well, and he's of course a national figure, but Thaddeus Stevens doesn't enjoy that same notoriety. Having studied Stevens and being, kind of one of the foremost experts in the country on Thaddeus Stevens, why do you think that is? Why do you think he's not remembered and revered in the way that other leaders have been?
It was an intentional campaign against, called the Lost Cause, which maybe you've talked about your students, where the South, after the Civil War, started an intentional campaign of rewriting the history of the Civil War, where they would say, "Oh, abolitionists were the cause of the Civil War, these crazy abolitionists." And they also said that slavery was not really the big issue, and that all of these, if I can say it, racist traitors really, heroes. We could put up all these statues to these people all over the country, which, as you know, is turning around in recent years. But Thaddeus Stevens came in for a special demonization. And there's been movies about Thaddeus Stevens over the years. And the Lincoln movie, which came out in 2012, was the first one where he was a hero, and the other two, he was the villain. Now, the first big movie, or the first movie that demonized Thaddeus Stevens, was a very famous film, Birth of a Nation, a silent film made in 1915. And they have a politician named Austin Stoneman in the movie, who's a Thaddeus Stevens caricature, down to the wig, by the way. And he is the villain, and the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes. They come riding to the rescue of a town taken over by a black mob. Then you had a 1942 movie called Andrew Johnson, oh, excuse me, Tennessee Johnson, which was a biopic about Andrew Johnson, which made Andrew Johnson, the character of Andrew Johnson, the hero, and the character of Thaddeus Stevens, the villain. In that case, Thaddeus Stevens was played by Lionel Barrymore, who went on to play a villain in It's a Wonderful Life, or the evil banker in It's a Wonderful Life, which is a Christmas movie which used to play on television all the time with Jimmy Stewart. So it's understandable. And also the history profession, your profession was against Thaddeus Stevens because, as you can see, Thaddeus Stevens was primarily associated with Reconstruction. And you had a professor at Columbia who was prominent, Dunning, who had the Dunning School, which basically said that Reconstruction, rather than trying to protect the newly freed slaves, was just Northern vengeance against the South. That it really was just something where they wanted to punish the South. And that's another thing I always hear, even to this day, when people are changing, they say Thaddeus Stevens wanted to punish the South. No, he wanted to protect the newly freed slaves. And that's seen, or at least it was construed as punishing the South because he wanted to see them being able to vote and such. So that's kind of a long answer, but it was not an accident that he was demonized and marginalized.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think the last question for you today, Ross, that I have is, Stevens was such an important figure, as you mentioned, funny, a brilliant tactician, a brilliant politician, and just really, truly a morally upstanding person who really sought to embody the ideals of equality at the deepest level. So what do you and I think he resisted the Confederacy with real tenacity, right?
Right.
Um, and a lot of these 14th Amendment issues as you mentioned around insurrection, et cetera, are coming up today. What lessons do you think that we can take from Stephen's life when we look at some of the divisiveness and the polarization and the constitutional crises that we're facing today?
That's probably the hardest question that I have. I the title of the statue is "Men in Pursuit of Justice Must Never Despair," which I think really sums up his life and really kind of has to sum up the way that the United States history ebbs and flows. Because the 14th Amendment, it had an afterlife. It continues to have an afterlife. Because what happened it was a great amendment, and it was then systematically struck down by the Supreme Court because it was clear it required equal treatment under the law. I mean, there's no doubt. But then the Supreme Court, I think it was in the 1890s, came up with Plessy versus Ferguson, where they said, oh, separate but equal is okay. Of course, separate but equal is not okay because it's never going to be equal. And then they even, on the saying certain rights could not be abridged of the states, the Supreme Court initially said, oh, these are very few rights over here that really don't matter at all. So you had a very conservative Supreme Court who was just knocking down the 14th Amendment for decades. And it was only until the mid 20th century when you had decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, where they said each separate but equal was not equal. So they were actually getting into the spirit of the 14th Amendment. And they also started doing things of applying the Bill of Rights to the state level. And in fact, the Roe versus Wade was based on the 14th Amendment, which basically applied the right to privacy under the Bill of Rights. As we can see now, the new conservative Supreme Court is chipping away at that, reversing Roe v. Wade. We might even see more 14th Amendment guarantees chipped away in the future. I don't know. I guess that I would say, even though things may be going backwards, people who are seeking justice should never, what was it? Should never
despair.
I just despair. People seeking should also remember despair. Yeah, basically, just keep on trying because the 14th Amendment is there. It just has to be implemented. And
Wonderful.
that's so that's his greatest legacy is the 14th Amendment. In fact, if you go to the statue of Thaddeus Stevens, we have him holding a document which has 14th Amendment on it.
And I think, just as Stephen's life, the 14th Amendment is under-recognized and misunderstood, I think, in our country. And so thank you so much for sharing about the 14th Amendment and about Thaddeus Stevens. And I just want to thank again Ross Hetrick, the president and founder of the Thaddeus Stevens Society of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Any students or anybody, community members who want to learn more, I encourage you to go to the Thaddeus Stevens Society website. They have a wonderful newsletter. You can learn more about him. And of course, if you're in Gettysburg, we'll be looking forward to seeing the new museum this year. So thanks again, Ross Hetrick, for teaching us today.
One last thing I just want to say, if you send
Yeah.
us your email, we will be glad to put you on our email list. So, which includes a monthly column that I write about Thaddeus Stevens. And talking just one last thing about the 14th Amendment. In recent years, I've been referring to it as the greatest unknown amendment to the Constitution, written by the greatest unknown person in American history.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ross. We really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you very much.